The Salem Witch Trials. Section 1. The Gathering Storm. The year was 1692, and the town of Salem in the Massachusetts Bay Colony lay nestled in a world both fragile and harsh. The settlers who lived there were descendants of Puritans who had crossed the ocean decades earlier, not in search of wealth, but of purity, determined to shape a community bound by God's word, untouched by the corruption of England and its established church. Salem itself was divided into two settlements: Salem town by the harbor, where merchants and traders dealt in goods, and Salem village, several miles inland, where farmers struggled to wrest a living from stony soil. Beneath their common faith ran a current of tension, of suspicion, of envy. It was a society tightly wound, where disputes over grazing rights, church leadership, and family inheritances simmered alongside fears of the devil's presence in the wilderness. Daily life in Salem village was bound by endless labor. Men rose before dawn to tend the fields, hacking at roots and stones, while women hauled water, churned butter, and minded swarms of children. Sabbath days were solemn, stretching from morning until night, with sermons that warned of sin, damnation, and the dangers of straying from God's path. Books were rare, and diversions scarcer still. Dancing, games, and even laughter were often regarded with suspicion. To the Puritans, the wilderness surrounding them was more than trees and rivers. It was the devil's domain, full of threats, both physical and spiritual. Native tribes still lived beyond the frontier, some trading, some resisting, and the memories of violent wars with them were not far behind. Every shadow in the forest seemed to harbor menace, and every hardship, a ruined harvest, a sick child, a house fire, could be a sign of God's wrath or Satan's hand. By the winter of 1691 into 1692, a peculiar unease was spreading in Salem village. The household of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of the village church, was at its center. Parris had come to Salem in 1689, a stern man whose sermons thundered against sin and disobedience. He was not universally loved. His demands for higher wages and ownership of the minister's house had divided the congregation. Yet, in his home, a chain of events began that would spill into hysteria. Living under his roof was his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams. Both girls were known to be lively, often restless under the strict discipline of Puritan life. Also in the household was Tituba, an enslaved woman of Caribbean origin, whose stories and strange knowledge fascinated the children. In the depths of that winter, Betty and Abigail began to behave strangely. They would fall into fits, thrashing on the floor, crying out in pain, though no cause could be seen. At times they shrieked that invisible forces pinched them, bit them, or tried to choke them. Their bodies contorted in unnatural ways, and they babbled incoherently. Neighbors whispered about witchcraft, for no ordinary illness seemed to match these symptoms. Soon, other young girls in Salem joined in, including Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and Mary Walcott, each reporting torments by unseen specters. The afflicted girls screamed in church, fell rigid in the snow, or claimed to see figures flying through the night. The adults of Salem, already wary of sin and Satan, were unsettled and frightened. Physicians summoned to examine the girls could find no natural explanation. The conclusion offered by one, William Griggs, was simple and chilling. The girls were under an evil hand. In the Puritan world, this meant witchcraft, and witchcraft was not merely superstition, it was a crime against God, punishable by death. Once the thought took hold, it spread like fire in dry brush. In February 1692, under pressure from Reverend Paris and other elders, the afflicted girls named names. They accused 3 women, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Each was vulnerable in Salem's tight society. Sarah Good was a destitute beggar, often muttering under her breath as she wandered from house to house, resented for her poverty. Sarah Osborne was an older woman who had scandalized neighbors by marrying her servant and neglecting church attendance. And Tituba, foreign and enslaved, was already viewed as an outsider with strange customs. When the accusations fell upon them, the village gathered to watch their examinations. Before the magistrates, the girls writhed and screamed, claiming to see the spirits of the accused tormenting them. When Sarah Good protested her innocence, the children fell to the floor as if struck. Sarah Osborne, frail and ill, denied the charges, but her words carried little weight. Tituba, however, did something different. At first she denied, but then, under relentless questioning, and perhaps in fear of her life, she confessed. She told a tale of black dogs, red cats, and a tall man who bid her serve him. She spoke of signing the Devil's Book, and of other witches in Salem. Her confession electrified the village, for it seemed proof that Satan was indeed at work among them. By admitting to witchcraft and naming others, she turned suspicion outward, and in so doing helped to ignite a frenzy that would spiral far beyond anyone's control. The accusations multiplied. The afflicted girls accused not only the poor and the marginalized, but also respected members of the community. Martha Corey, a full church member, was named, shocking many. Rebecca Nurse, an elderly woman known for her piety and charity, was accused despite widespread disbelief that such a devout woman could be a witch. Once accused, however, the stain was nearly impossible to remove. Spectral evidence, the testimony that one had seen the spirit or specter of a person torment them, was accepted by magistrates. Even if no physical proof existed, the afflicted girls continued to scream, fall, and convulse in court, their bodies seemingly testifying against the accused. Salem's jails filled quickly. Those who confessed and named others were often spared immediate execution, while those who held firm in their innocence found themselves trapped. Families were torn apart, neighbors turned against neighbors. Even the ministers of Massachusetts were divided. Some urged caution, while others pressed for relentless pursuit of witches. The colony's leaders saw the trials as a battle for survival against the devil's army. In the early months, as winter thawed into spring, the scale of accusations grew almost unbelievable. More than 100 names were whispered, scrawled, or shouted in court. Fear fed upon itself. To question the truth of the trials was to risk being accused oneself. Silence was safer than doubt. Even the most respected men and women could not be sure they were beyond suspicion. Farmers plowed their fields with unease. Mothers hushed their children more sternly, and prayers in the meeting house were more fervent than ever. Salem Village was no longer simply a small community of struggling farmers and strict preachers. It was a place stalked by invisible enemies, where unseen claws tore at the fabric of daily life. The noose of hysteria tightened. The village green that once echoed with sermons and solemn hymns now became a stage for weeping, accusations, and the grim work of the magistrates. Those who had lived together for decades now eyed one another with suspicion. The devil once imagined lurking in the dark forest, was believed to be inside Salem itself, hiding behind the faces of neighbors, waiting to strike. At night, the cries of the afflicted echoed across the fields, and the flicker of lanterns carried the news of fresh arrests from house to house. It seemed no home was safe, no family untouched. The storm had only begun, and before it would end, Salem would witness scenes so haunting that they would echo in memory for centuries. Yet even in these first months, one question haunted those who dared think beyond fear. How could a handful of children's cries overturn the order of an entire community? And if innocence could not shield a woman like Rebecca Nurse, who among them could claim safety? Section 2. The Trials Ignite. By the spring of 1692, Salem had become a stage of dread. The afflicted girls, whose fits had once been confined to Reverend Parris's kitchen, now held the attention of the entire colony. They screamed in court, pointed accusing fingers, and claimed to see the specters of their neighbors flying through the night or whispering poison into their ears. The magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, sat grim and unyielding, demanding answers from the accused. Their belief was unshaken. Satan was at work in Salem, and the people of God must root him out before the entire colony fell under his sway. Every hearing swelled with villagers eager to witness the battle between good and evil. The meeting house filled with cries, gasps, and the heavy silence of disbelief as respected neighbors were named as witches. The jails groaned under the weight of the accused. Prisoners were shackled in irons, their food meager, their bodies weakened by cold and filth. Families often had to pay for their loved ones' imprisonment, selling livestock or land to cover the fees. Some died waiting for trial. But it was not merely poverty or sickness that weighed upon the accused. It was the sense that their fates were sealed, that innocence offered no shield. For once a name was spoken by the afflicted, the village believed. And once believed, the magistrates demanded submission. Confession was encouraged, for it not only saved the accused from immediate death, but also confirmed the fears of the court, giving proof that witches indeed walked among them. To deny, however, was to challenge the truth of the afflicted girls, the authority of the magistrates, and the righteousness of the trials. Denial, in Salem, was a death sentence disguised as defiance. One of the earliest to be swept into this storm was Bridget Bishop, a woman already notorious in Salem for her independent spirit. She was twice widowed, ran a tavern, and dressed more colorfully than her neighbors approved, with bright red bodices that stood out against the drab grays and browns of Puritan dress. Her past included disputes with neighbors and accusations of witchcraft decades earlier, though none had been proven. To the Puritan eye, she embodied rebellion, outspoken, visible, unwilling to fade into quiet obedience. When the afflicted cried out against her, claiming her specter attacked them, the case seemed inevitable. At her trial in June, she protested, "I am innocent. I know nothing of it. I am no witch." But her words fell into the sea of fear already churning in the courtroom. The afflicted shrieked at her presence, collapsing as though struck by unseen blows. The jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to hang. Bridget Bishop became the first execution, hanged on June 10th, 1692, at Gallows Hill. Her death set the grim precedent that the court would not hesitate to spill blood. Once the rope tightened around her neck, Salem's path was sealed. Each execution confirmed the existence of witches, and each confirmation bred new accusations. The girls, empowered by the fear they inspired, named more: wealthy, poor, young, old. None were spared. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old matriarch respected for her piety, soon stood accused. Her neighbors signed petitions declaring her innocence, testifying to her goodness. Yet the afflicted claimed her specter, pinched them, choked them, urged them to renounce God. At her trial, Rebecca Nurse was first acquitted, but the decision angered the afflicted and their supporters. The judges pressed the jury to reconsider, and under pressure, they reversed their verdict. On July 19th, Rebecca Nurse was hanged alongside Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wa. The crowd gathered at Gallows Hill saw 5 women swing in the hot summer air, and still the accusations did not cease. The hangings became almost ritualistic. Processions wound through the streets, the condemned riding in carts, praying aloud, or remaining silent in despair. Crowds gathered, murmuring prayers or staring with hardened faces, as though watching a plague be purged from their midst. The gallows loomed above them all, a wooden altar of fear and justice twisted together. Some victims went bravely, declaring their innocence with their last breath. Sarah Good, as the rope tightened, cursed the judge and jury, declaring God would give them blood to drink. Others wept or prayed, but none were spared. The devil's supposed army was cut down, one by one, before the eyes of their neighbors. Amidst these horrors, the afflicted girls grew ever bolder. They named George Burroughs, the former minister of Salem Village. His arrest shook the colony, for Burroughs was not a marginalized beggar or an eccentric widow, but a Harvard-educated preacher. Yet the girls insisted his specter tormented them, and whispers spread that his extraordinary strength, he was known to carry barrels of cider, unaided, was granted by Satan. At his trial, the court listened as the afflicted convulsed in his presence, and neighbors testified to his supposed unnatural feats. When Burroughs was condemned, it marked a turning point. If even ministers could be witches, who was safe? On August 19th, Burroughs was hanged alongside 4 others. In a moment that unsettled even his executioners, he recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly at the gallows, something believed impossible for a witch. Many in the crowd murmured that he was innocent, but the judges pressed forward, silencing doubt with the crack of rope. Cotton Mather, one of the most prominent ministers in New England, urged the crowd not to be swayed, declaring that the devil could appear as an angel of light. With Burroughs's body hanging, Salem's descent deepened, and the people learned to choke their doubts, for to question was dangerous. The methods of the court grew harsher. Those accused were stripped, searched for witches, marks, blemishes, scars, or moles believed to be teats for demonic familiars. Suspects were forced to recite the 10 Commandments, stumbling under the pressure of scrutiny, their stumbles taken as proof of guilt. Others were tied neck and heels for hours until their limbs stiffened, or left in cells without light or warmth. The afflicted screamed at them in court, claiming invisible daggers pierced their flesh, claiming specters whispered in their ears. The court accepted such testimony, and the fate of the accused hung on the words of trembling children. Meanwhile, outside the courtrooms and gallows, daily life grew twisted. Fields lay fallow as farmers rotted in prison. Families fell into ruin, their lands confiscated, their children scattered. In Salem Village, the lines of division sharpened. Old grudges found new life in accusations. neighbors settling scores by whispering names. The Putnam family, central among the accusers, wielded enormous influence. Their grievances against rival families echoed in the voices of the afflicted girls. The trials were no longer simply a battle against Satan. They had become a weapon in the hands of men and women, driven by envy, fear, and revenge. Yet not all bowed their heads to the storm. Some spoke out. John Proctor, a farmer known for his bluntness, openly denounced the girls as frauds, insisting their fits were feigned. For his boldness, he too was accused. His pregnant wife, Elizabeth, was named as well, though Elizabeth's execution was delayed until after she gave birth. John Proctor was hanged on August 19th, the same day as George Burroughs. His final words declared Salem's shame, crying that his death was the murder of innocence. His body, like the others, was cut down and thrown into a shallow grave at the execution site, denied Christian burial. Still, the trials marched forward. September brought the bloodiest harvest. On the 22nd of that month, 8 more were hanged. Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Ann Putiter, Wilmot Red, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell. Gallows Hill bore witness to their last breaths, their bodies swinging in grim silence. Among them, Mary Easty, sister to Rebecca Nurse, had written a moving petition to the court, begging them to reconsider their methods and warning that innocent blood was being shed. Her plea was ignored. With her death, the sense of doom in Salem grew so heavy that even some who had once cheered the trials began to wonder if the devil had tricked them all, not by hiding in witches, but by twisting the people into his instruments. And then came the death of Giles Corey, one of the darkest moments in the saga. At 81 years old, Giles was accused of witchcraft alongside his wife Martha. When he refused to plead guilty or not guilty, knowing either choice would lead to the loss of his estate, the court subjected him to peine forte et dure. Pressing, he was laid on the ground, heavy stones piled upon his chest, each day more weight added. For 3 days he endured, his tongue pressed from his mouth, his ribs breaking, until he died. His last words, legend holds, were a defiant more weight. The horror of his death spread whispers through the colony, for even among the faithful, such cruelty seemed more fitting for tyrants than saints. By the autumn of 1692, Salem was drenched in fear and grief. Families had lost fathers, mothers, children. The gallows stood like a shadow over the town, and the afflicted girls still screamed in church, pointing to unseen shapes. The air grew colder, the harvest thin, and the people of Salem began to wonder if their village had not been cursed more deeply than ever before. And still, the magistrates pressed on, demanding more names, more confessions, more blood. The devil, they declared, was not yet defeated. But beneath their words, doubt began to stir. Some ministers questioned the use of spectral evidence. Some villagers wondered aloud if Satan's greatest trick had been to turn them against one another. Yet the hangings continued, and the noose tightened, not only around the necks of the accused, but around the soul of Salem itself. Section 3. The Collapse and the Curse that followed. The autumn winds of 1692 carried with them the chill of unease, and Salem, once so certain of its mission, began to tremble beneath the weight of its own fury. By September, more than a dozen corpses swung in shallow graves near Gallows Hill, and the jails still overflowed with prisoners awaiting judgment. Yet something in the air had shifted. The harvest failed, families slipped into ruin, and even the devout could not ignore the disquiet gnawing at their souls. Whispers rose in taverns and fields. Had Salem gone too far? Had the devil's trick been not witches among them, but their own blind zeal? The turning point began subtly, as doubt often does, creeping into the corners of minds that once burned with certainty. Ministers outside Salem village muttered against the court's reliance on spectral evidence, the visions of the afflicted girls who claimed to see ghosts and demons. Reverend Increase Mather, father of Cotton Mather himself, declared it would be better that 10 witches escape than one innocent person be condemned. His words spread across the colony like a seed of reason, stirring unease in hearts already heavy with grief. For what if the condemned had been innocent? What if Salem had traded its soul to chase shadows? Still, the trials pressed on, though each execution left more doubt in its wake. When Mary Easty, sister of the martyred Rebecca Nurse, wrote her final petition, pleading with the judges to halt their bloody course, her words echoed in the silence after her death. She did not beg for her life, but for the lives of those yet to be condemned. The dignity of her plea struck a chord that no shrieks of the afflicted could silence. Yet the court hardened itself, insisting that the devil was cunning and that his followers could appear godly even at the gallows. Salem staggered forward, caught between its fear of witches and its fear of what it had become. By October, the trials had reached their height of madness. Nearly 200 names had been whispered, and the prisons strained with the weight of human misery. Husbands were forced to watch wives shackled in filth. Mothers wept for children dragged from their homes. Families sold land to pay prison fees, only to lose everything when the accused were executed and their property seized. Salem was unraveling, its fabric torn by greed, vengeance, and hysteria. Yet still the afflicted girls pointed, screamed, and convulsed, dragging more souls into the abyss. It was then that they overreached. In October, the girls accused Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps of Massachusetts. The charge struck like lightning, for Lady Mary was far removed from the jealous feuds of Salem village. The governor, already disturbed by the chaos his colony had descended into, now saw the madness reach his own household. He ordered the court of Owire and Terminer, the special tribunal established to hear the witchcraft cases, dissolved. In its place, a new court was formed, one less eager to accept spectral evidence, one more cautious in its judgments. Without the shrieking visions of the afflicted to serve as proof, the machinery of accusation began to falter. The spell was breaking, but it had already claimed too much blood. On September 22nd, the last executions at Gallows Hill had taken place, 8 lives cut short in one grim day. Afterward, no more hangings followed, though dozens still languished in jail. Slowly, cases were dismissed, prisoners released, and the cries of the afflicted lost their power. By May of 1693, Governor Phipps ordered the remaining accused freed. The frenzy had ended, leaving behind a silence more dreadful than the screams that had filled the meeting house months before. But Salem was not cleansed, it was haunted. Families of the dead carried grief like a second skin, their neighbors' betrayal etched deep in memory. The bodies of those executed had been denied Christian burial, left in shallow pits at the execution site. Some families crept out at night to reclaim the corpses, hiding them in secret graves to grant them dignity in death. The gallows itself rotted into the earth, but its shadow remained, stretching across the years like a curse. Giles Corey's gruesome death by pressing lingered in whispers, his defiance, more weight, echoing like a prophecy. Some claimed his spirit haunted the land, a black figure seen near Gallows Hill whenever calamity loomed over Salem. The Nurse family's descendants spoke of strange sounds in the woods, of wind that howled like voices crying for justice. Whether true or born of guilty conscience, Salem itself seemed to carry the weight of the blood it had shed. The afflicted girls, once the arbiters of life and death, faded into obscurity. Ann Putnam Jr., years later, would stand before her congregation and confess her guilt, admitting she had been deceived by the devil and misled into accusing innocence. But her apology could not return the dead, nor mend the wounds that time could not heal. The others lived out their lives in silence or bitterness, their names remembered not as holy instruments, but as harbingers of destruction. For decades after, Salem wrestled with its shame. The colony declared a day of fasting and prayer in 1697, begging God's forgiveness for the sins committed in hysteria. In time, restitution was granted to the families of some victims. Land returned, coins paid in compensation for lives unjustly taken. Yet no restitution could bring back the fathers, mothers, and children who had perished beneath Salem's ropes and stones. Their names became etched in history, a grim litany: Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, George Burroughs, Giles Corey, Sarah Good, and so many more. Innocent blood spilled on Puritan soil, staining it forever. And so Salem became a lesson, a cautionary tale whispered through the centuries. But the lesson was not simple. It was not merely about superstition or the folly of believing in witches. It was about fear. The fear that turns neighbor against neighbor. The fear that lets children's words outweigh reason. The fear that cloaks vengeance in righteousness. In Salem, fear became a noose, and once it was tightened, it strangled not only the accused, but the very soul of the village. Even now, the legacy lingers. Tourists walk the streets of Salem, drawn by the ghosts of 1692. Some come to gawk, others to mourn, still others to seek the strange thrill of standing where hysteria once ruled. The gallows have long since vanished, but the hill remembers. The jails are gone, but the earth beneath remembers the chains. The names of the dead are carved on memorials, their silence speaking louder than the cries that once condemned them. And some say when the wind cuts through the trees on a cold October night, you can still hear it. The creak of ropes, the echo of a minister's prayer, the last defiant words of a man crushed under stones. The Salem Witch Trials ended, but the curse of their memory endures. It is the curse of humanity itself, that fear can drive us to slaughter our own, that righteousness can be twisted into cruelty, that a village seeking purity can descend into blood. Salem's soil, heavy with the weight of its dead, warns all who tread upon it. Beware the fever of fear, for it burns hotter than fire, and once kindled, it spares no one. Story 2. The Curse of Giles Corey. They say the ground of Salem groans when it remembers, and no memory weighs heavier than that of Giles Corey. His name lingers like a shadow on the tongue, a man who met death not at the gallows, but beneath the crushing weight of stone. To tell his tale is to tell of pain, defiance, and a curse that some believe still hangs over the town to this very day. Giles Corey was not a saintly man. Before the witch trials, he was known as a stubborn farmer, a man quick to anger, sometimes quarrelsome with neighbors. He had once even been fined for the death of a servant, beaten so severely that she succumbed. Yet, in Salem's fever, even such a man could become a victim of hysteria. When accusations spread like wildfire in 1692, Giles's wife, Martha Corey, was named among the witches. Her piety had not saved her. Her skepticism of the girl's visions had turned suspicion upon her head, and Giles, in standing beside her, found himself pulled into the maelstrom. At first, he had testified against his own wife, claiming she kept strange books, that her mutterings troubled his prayers. But when the noose tightened, when he saw the fury of the court consume Martha, his heart shifted. He recanted, defended her, stood by her name. It was too late. The girls shrieked, fell into fits, pointed trembling fingers at him as well. And so Giles Corey, stubborn farmer, became a marked man. In September of 1692, he was brought before the court. The judges demanded he enter a plea, guilty or not guilty, yet Giles remained silent. His lips pressed tight, his eyes hard as stone, for he knew the law. To plead was to allow trial, and to allow trial was to invite the theft of his land, leaving his children beggars, but to say nothing. To refuse the plea forced the court into a grim measure known as peine forte et dure, pressing by heavy stones, a torture meant to break silence and wring forth words. Giles Corey, unyielding, chose silence, and so the sentence was carried out. On September 19th, he was dragged to a field near Salem, stripped and bound. A plank was laid upon his chest, and the executioners brought stones, heavy, rough, jagged. They placed them, one by one, upon him, waiting for the words they craved. His ribs cracked, his lungs fought for air, his body strained against the suffocating weight. But from his lips came only two words, repeated again and again, a defiance etched into the marrow of Salem's history. More, wait. Witnesses spoke of the horror. Sheriff George Corwin, who oversaw the torture, sneered and demanded Corey yield. The crowd whispered prayers. Women wept, yet none dared intervene. For hours, the weight grew heavier. Blood poured from Corey's mouth, his tongue swelled, his chest caved. Still, he did not break. As the sun bled across the horizon, Giles Corey's body gave way, crushed beneath the stones. His final breath, a curse, spat into the earth itself. And then the legend began. They say before the last stone fell, Corey turned his gaze upon Sheriff Corwin and spat a prophecy, that Salem and its officers would be cursed, that blood would haunt the line of the sheriff, that the town itself would never wash clean of this crime. Whether truly spoken or birthed in the whispers of guilt, the curse stuck to Salem like tar. Strange tales followed. Sheriff George Corwin himself would be found dead in 1696, only 4 years later. At the age of 30, his body, some said, swelled and turned black before burial, a sign of the curse's hand. Others told of the Corey curse haunting every sheriff of Essex County thereafter. 4 generations, sheriffs of Salem were plagued with illness, chest pains, and strange misfortunes. So deep was the fear that by the 1990s, the Essex County Sheriff's Office officially moved out of Salem, shifting its headquarters to Middleton. Locals whispered it was not modern practicality that drove them, but the long shadow of Corey's dying words. The field where Giles died remained barren for years. Children claimed to hear groans from the soil, as if the earth itself remembered the weight upon it. Farmers spoke of stones rising from the ground each spring, smooth and heavy, as though pushed upward by the restless spirit below. Travelers told of a dark figure seen walking near the site, stooped yet unbroken, a phantom carrying his curse across the centuries. Some swore the ghost of Giles Corey appeared before every great calamity in Salem, from the fires that ravaged the town to the shipwrecks along its coast, even to the Great Fire of 1914 that reduced much of Salem to ash. And still, the curse clings. Guides in Salem today tell his story by lantern light, their voices hushed as though the spirit of Giles Corey listens. Tourists walk the memorial stones, some leaving offerings of coins, others muttering apologies to the man crushed by fear and greed. The Corey homestead is gone, but his name remains etched into the very bones of Salem. Yet perhaps the truest horror is not the ghost nor the curse, but the memory of that slow, merciless death. The vision of a man pinned beneath stone, refusing to yield, while a village watched and did nothing. And so the tale of Giles Corey endures. Farmer accused, witch victim, defiant martyr, cursed specter. His story is the story of Salem itself, a place crushed by the weight of its own sins, groaning still beneath the stones it laid upon its people. They say if you walk Gallows Hill at dusk, you may hear it, the scrape of stone on stone, the whisper of strained breath, and a low, gravel-rough voice demanding from the darkness more weight. Story 3. The Guilt of Ann Putnam, Jr. The witch trials of Salem were not born in the hands of stern judges, nor the gallows rope alone, but in the trembling voices of young girls who claimed to see the devil walking among their neighbors. And of those girls, none carried the stain of history more deeply than Ann Putnam, Jr. She was only 12 when it began, a child whose screams of torment and visions of shadowy specters would ignite the flames that consumed Salem. Yet her story does not end in childish fear, ends with an older woman, hollow-eyed and broken, whispering apologies too late. Haunted by ghosts no exorcism could drive away. In 1692, Anne lived under the heavy shadow of the Putnam family name. Her father, Thomas Putnam, was a stern man, quick to quarrel, and her mother harbored a deep distrust of neighbors. The Putnams had land disputes with many in Salem village, and suspicion was already a poison running through their veins. Anne was caught in this world of fear and whispered grudges, where every creak of the woods, every sick cow, every stillborn child could be turned into a sign of witchcraft. When Betty Paris, daughter of the minister, began her fit screaming, contorting, claiming invisible hands pinched and burned, Huron joined in. Perhaps at first it was mimicry, a child swept into hysteria, her small body shaking in unison with her friends. But her words held power, and when she pointed her finger at the accused, their lives unraveled. She was not just a follower, she became one of the loudest voices, her accusations cutting sharp. It was Ann Putnam who cried out against Martha Corey, against Rebecca Nurse, against George Burroughs, the former minister who stood at the gallows reciting the Lord's Prayer until the rope choked his voice. She pointed at neighbors, at elders, at respected women of the church. In total, Anne's words helped condemn more than 60 souls. Each gasp of fear, each shriek that demons tormented her, wove another noose, carved another grave. But what did Anne truly see? Some whispered that her visions were nothing more than rehearsed theatrics, coached by her family to remove rivals and enemies. Others believed she was possessed by guilt and imagination, a child whose play had turned to nightmare. And some believed the darker tale that Anne, whether knowingly or not, had indeed been touched by something unholy, that her screams were not lies but echoes of forces too great for a child to comprehend. As the executions mounted, the town began to turn uneasy. The sheer number of accused, the respectability of their names, the horror of hanging old women and men for unseen crimes, it gnawed at Salem's conscience. By the end of 1692, the trials collapsed under their own weight. Prison doors creaked open, judges grew silent, and the gallows stood empty. But the dead did not return, and the voices that condemned them remained. Ann Putnam Jr. survived. She grew into a woman with the memory of death chained to her. Her parents died when she was still young, leaving her with the responsibility of raising her siblings. Poverty and hardship marked her life, and she never married, as though cursed by the very hysteria she had once fueled. Yet the true curse lay in her mind. For years she carried her silence, but silence grows heavy, like stone pressing down upon the chest. And so, in 1706, 14 years after Salem's frenzy, Ann Putnam Jr., at the age of 27, stood before the church and confessed. Her words were trembling, but they struck the congregation with the weight of a ghost's hand. She admitted that her accusations had been false, that her screams and visions had been guided not by righteousness, but by deception and delusion. "I desire to be humbled before God," she declared, weeping, "for that sad and humbling providence, that I, being a chief instrument in accusing of others, whereby their blood was shed." The church recorded her apology, but it could not wash the blood from her hands. She named herself a deluded instrument of the devil, begging forgiveness for sins that had destroyed families and blackened Salem's name. But not all could forgive. Among the families of the hanged, some spat at her repentance, others turned away in silence. How could words erase the image of Rebecca Nurse's frail body swinging from the gallows? Of Giles Corey's chest crushed beneath stone? Of Martha Corey dragged to her death with Ann's accusation echoing in her ears? Yet some claimed Ann's torment never ended. They said she was haunted, not only by memory, but by the very spirits she had condemned. Neighbors whispered of hearing her voice at night, begging unseen figures to leave her be. Some swore they saw her wandering in the fields, speaking to empty air, her eyes wide, as though she saw the hanged still swaying from spectral ropes. Children dared each other to peer into her windows, and claimed they saw Anne speaking with shadows. Whether madness or haunting, she carried Salem's ghosts within her. And so she lived, alone, her body aging but her heart trapped in 1692, the year of screaming girls and gallows. She died in 1716 at the age of 37, her grave a modest stone in Salem's soil. Some said that even in death she was not free, that her spirit joins the chorus of Salem's damned, walking among the whispering trees of Gallows Hill. Tourists today who seek her resting place leave flowers, but they do so with unease, for they know the story of Ann Putnam Jr. is not one of innocence, but of horror, the horror of words spoken by a child that birthed death. The true terror of her story is not supernatural, though the ghost tales linger, but human. The terror of how fragile truth can be when fear grips a town, how easily the trembling finger of a child can condemn a neighbor to death. It is the terror of guilt festering for years, until at last it spills forth in a broken confession. But by then the damage is done, the graves are filled, and Salem's soil will never forget. Some say if you stand by her grave at night and whisper her name, you may hear weeping from beneath the earth, soft and broken. Others claim her ghost appears not as a young girl, but as an older woman, racked with sorrow, her hands stained red though she never lifted a blade. And some insist that on stormy nights, when the wind rattles through the trees, you can hear the faint cries of the accused in her voice, carried on the wind, a chilling reminder of the child who became Salem's most haunted soul. Ann Putnam Jr.'s story is the story of guilt given flesh, of innocence corrupted by fear, of how a single voice can summon death and never find peace again. And perhaps that is why Salem itself remains haunted, not by witches, nor even by devils, but by the echoes of children who cried wolf and the blood that cry demanded. Story 4. The Gallows Hill Ghosts. You can picture yourself in Salem, walking slowly along uneven ground that has been paved over, landscaped, and built upon across 3 long centuries. You may not notice it at first, the houses, the quiet suburban roads, the trimmed lawns, but beneath this surface lies the site once known to every frightened villager, Gallows Hill. It was here, in the year 1692, that men and women accused of witchcraft climbed a wooden ladder, stood upon the platform, and felt the noose tighten around their necks. The executions that took place here were intended as spectacles of justice, warnings to the community about the dangers of sin and sorcery. Instead, they became a theater of dread, one whose echoes never entirely left the soil. The records of the Salem Witch Trials mention the hangings in plain, almost bureaucratic detail. 19 people were sentenced to die by the rope. A farmer, a minister, several elderly women, and even a defiant man who refused to enter a plea. They all found their way here. Their names are preserved in the court documents, but the texture of those final hours is harder to capture. The condemned were led in carts up the hill, followed by crowds who whispered psalms or muttered fearful gossip. The sky seemed to change when those processions reached the crest. There are scattered reports in letters from witnesses who claimed the weather darkened unnaturally, as though heavy clouds were drawn over the sun at the very moment the condemned arrived. Whether those reports were exaggerations or sincere observations is difficult to know, but they became part of the lasting legend that Gallows Hill itself rejected the violence done upon it. Imagine the soundscape of that day. The murmuring of townsfolk clustered below, the creak of wood as the ladder shifted under weight, the sharp cry of a sheriff ordering silence, then the sound of the rope pulling taut. There was no dignity in these deaths. The condemned were not killed instantly, their bodies often twisted, struggling, the life leaving slowly as the crowd tried not to look directly. The stench of fear and sweat clung to the air. This is the atmosphere that stayed in Salem, and many believed it never truly dispersed. After the executions, the bodies were cut down quickly, denied burial in consecrated ground. Families often crept back under cover of darkness to retrieve them, smuggling them to hidden graves in orchards or on the edges of farmland. This practice itself fed rumors, for villagers whispered that the spirits of the dead remained restless, unable to find peace since they had been denied a Christian resting place. Gallows Hill became a space associated not just with death, but with a kind of interrupted passage between worlds. The hauntings, as they came to be told, began almost immediately. One account survives from a Salem farmer who swore that on a fog-laden evening in the autumn of 1692, he passed near the hill and heard voices carried on the mist. He claimed the words were not in English, but in a strange tongue he could not understand, like chanting or low lamentation. Others reported seeing figures standing against the skyline at night, silhouettes that vanished when approached. In later decades, as Salem moved on and tried to bury its shame, Gallows Hill remained unused land. Children avoided it. Livestock refused to graze there. Even in the 18th century, travelers noted that the area seemed unnaturally still, devoid of birdsong. Local ministers advised people not to dwell on the past, but that advice carried little weight against stories passed around family tables. A woman walking alone, who felt a hand press upon her shoulder, only to find no one behind her. A group of boys daring each other to climb the hill at midnight, only to flee in terror, after seeing what they described as faces hanging in the dark, suspended from invisible ropes. As the 19th century dawned, Salem became a place of curiosity for outsiders. Writers and historians began to romanticize the witch trials, turning them into cautionary tales of hysteria. Visitors arrived to ask about the gallows, and though no clear marker remained, locals pointed them toward the rise where so many had died. By then, Gallows Hill had already acquired a reputation beyond its actual history. Some said the grass grew patchy, as though scorched from within. Others claimed that every time a storm broke over Salem, lightning seemed drawn toward the hill. There were even reports from the 1830s of workers attempting to quarry stone from the area, only to abandon their efforts after a series of accidents. One man lost his footing and fell to his death. Another swore that while he worked, he heard the faint creak of a rope behind him, though he was alone. The project ended abruptly, and the land was left once more to its silence. By the 20th century, Salem had fully embraced its reputation as a city tied to witchcraft. Shops sold charms, tours led visitors through stories of the trials, and Halloween transformed the place into a festival of the macabre. Yet Gallows Hill remained curiously avoided, almost peripheral to the commercial embrace of witch lore. Local residents insisted they still felt unease there. Ghost hunters recorded whispers on their devices, claiming them as electronic voice phenomena. Some swore they saw shadowy figures moving along the ridge. A few even reported physical sensations, choking, pressure on the throat, or the feeling of ropes brushing against their necks. What is striking about Gallows Hill is that the terror lingers, not in a dramatic fashion, but in small, quiet details. You do not see a specter rushing at you. Rather, you feel as though you are not alone, as though the soil remembers. The horror is historic, grounded in real death and injustice, yet infused with the sense that such wrongs do not fade easily. Walking there today, you might notice how your footsteps seem muffled, how the air holds an odd heaviness. You may pass a neighbor's house or a child playing in the street and think nothing of it. But once you stand on the hill itself, the landscape feels altered. The ordinary falls away, and the memory of 1692 presses through, cold and undeniable. The ghosts of Gallows Hill are less about rattling chains than about conscience. The townspeople of Salem built their community upon the deaths of neighbors they condemned without sufficient proof. Those deaths left scars, not only on families, but upon the very ground. When you hear of a visitor today who claims to see a figure standing on the ridge, or who swears they heard a rope snap in the darkness, you might dismiss it as imagination fed by history books. Yet it is worth remembering that generation after generation of Salem's own inhabitants, long before tourism, long before ghost tours, spoke of the same things: whispers in the fog, faces in the dark, the sense of watching eyes where no one should be. And perhaps that is the greatest horror of Gallows Hill. Not simply that people were executed there, but that the community accepted it only later to regret. The place remains a reminder that hysteria and fear can destroy lives, and that the silence afterward is never entirely silent. The land keeps its secrets, and every so often it seems to murmur them back, in voices only the most attentive or the most unlucky will hear. So when you think of Salem, you may picture the trials, the judges, the names of the accused. But Gallows Hill itself tells another story, one that is not fully written in records, but in impressions, in shadows, and in an unease that has lasted more than 3 centuries. You may ask yourself, if injustice truly imprints itself on the places where it occurred, how many other hills, fields, and city streets carry unseen legacies of the same kind?